I'm looking at Rafeef Ziadah's spoken word poetry, and particularly her use of performative anger. Before I analyze a few of her poems, I want to talk about her political and historical context, as well as set up the theoretical lenses I use to analyze her poetry. As a Palestinian, Ziadah, like other Palestinians, lives in the shadow of the Nakba, the 1948 event in which Israel occupied Palestine and basically kicked out 750,000 Palestinians, making it illegal for them to stay in their homeland. This event is often discussed as the Palestine War or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which suggests that there's mutuality of aggression on both sides when the truth is better encapsulated in the Palestinian term for this event, Nakba, meaning catastrophe. As Israeli historian Ilan Pappé observes, this is not war or conflict, this was an calculated ethnic cleansing. The pain of Palestinians' displacement and loss has only been intensified by false narratives perpetuated by Israel and believed by much of the world. Again, Pappé notes that when it comes to the dispossession of Israel, by Israel of the Palestinians, there is a deep chasm between the reality and the representation. And this has made it difficult for Palestinians to tell their stories and have their stories heard, primarily because, as Abu Lughod and Sadi observe, powerful nations have not wanted to listen. And so, in light of collective and individual trauma that stems from this dehumanization and displacement, there is, in fact, value and power for Palestinians in remembering and recounting their lived experiences in what is known as memory work, the process of uncovering and narrating the past. Giving the voice to individual and collective memories of trauma can counter the public discourse that gets it wrong, and they can use memory as a weapon. And in the painful absence of a global audience for Palestinian stories of loss and suffering, a number of artists and authors, such as spoken word poet Rafeef Ziadah, have channeled their experiences and memories into writing and performance as a way to tell their stories, but also as a way to challenge apathy on the part of those who could actually make a change. In my paper, I examine Ziadah's performance of anger in her spoken word poetry, and specifically I argue that her embodied anger turns her spoken word poetry into acts of decolonial resistance and seeks to potentially stir her audience from apathy into action. Turning to the more theoretical framework that I look at, I argue that Ziadah's poems do not just describe resistance, but they are, in fact, acts of resistance in and of themselves. J.L. Austen coined the term speech acts, and that is what I argue Ziadah's poems become. And a differentiating feature of speech acts is that they don't just describe reality, they enact it through the speaker by the use of specific words, body language, intonation, and other means of communication. And so Ziadah uses her spoken word performances as embodied acts of resistance that implicate her privileged audiences in the West. And central to her resistance politics in her poetry is her performance of anger. It's not surprising that Ziadah is angry, considering the systematic erasure of Palestinian memory and pain, but her performance of anger does fly in the face of the sexist, dehumanizing stereotypes that are part and parcel of colonial rhetoric, particularly the Zionist rhetoric in this case. In the model of Audre Lorde's response to patriarchal racism, I argue that Ziadah uses her anger in a precise and focused way. Lorde says that every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. And this is, I argue, how Ziadah uses her anger. Now turn to look at a few of Ziadah's poems and to see how she performs her anger and how she turns her words into speech acts. In Shades of Anger, Ziadah describes the story behind the poem, and in fact, in an interview I watched, she says that this event was what prompted her to actually start writing spoken word poetry. At a demonstration, she was kicked in the stomach by a man and told, "You deserve to be raped before you have your terrorist children." Ziadah then begins her poem by speaking about her anger in Arabic in a move that asserts both her Palestinian anger and entwines it with her Palestinian identity and entwines it with her anger, and she apologizes for neither. And she later in the poem addresses an Orientalist expectation that she, as a Palestinian woman, would be subservient, silent, and not angry by sarcastically asking, "Sorry, should I not scream?" Throughout her poem, Ziadah defiantly repeats with a physical swagger, "I am an Arab woman of color and we come in all shades of anger." But in her final words, she changes the phrase from merely descriptive to performative. Her declaration, "I am an Arab woman of color, beware, beware my anger," becomes a warning to her listeners that her anger has a purpose and a source, that in the face of stereotypes and violence, she will resist. And this change, in the end, makes her anger pointed, ostensibly at the man referenced at the beginning, but more broadly to anyone, including the audience, who might reduce or demean her and her Palestinian experience. In her poem, "We Teach Life, Sir," Ziadah resists the reduction of Palestinian loss and displacement into sound bites and into, quote, human stories that are not, quote, not political. As with Shades of Anger, she prefaces her performance with the experience that inspired the poem, in this case, a journalist asking her, "Don't you think it would be fine if you just stopped teaching your children to hate?" She uses prefaces like this, though not technically part of her poems, as a way to show the listener the context and to show the listener the ignorant mindsets she is actively resisting with her poetry. In this poem, one of the ways she performs her anger is by acting out the infuriating experience of trying to hold her emotions together in professional settings while journalists and other people spew reductionist narratives about her people and their experiences. And she conveys this bubbling anger through skillful fluctuations of volume, level, and body language, and she switches from quiet and respectful and physically slight to loud with broad gestures and pained facial expressions. And in the end, she does not contain her anger anymore. Instead, she shows her exasperation at the ridiculous idea that Palestinians have the luxury of distinguishing between the human and political. As Audre Lorde and Sadi note, and Ziadah here affirms, Palestinian memory is, at its heart, political. And in the end of this poem, she tells her audience, "We Palestinians wake up every morning to teach the rest of the world life." And when she says rest of the world, she looks out and points at the audience. And this physical act, along with her words, implicates the audience as the target of her words rather than just the man from her preface. And in the final poem I look at, Hadil, Ziadah enacts her anger and grief as she responds to and resists the calculated dissemination of misinformation and erasures that occur in Israel's reporting on the deaths of Palestinian children. In this poem, Ziadah uses repetition to great effect. She explains that when Israeli and American media say we regret the incident in response to Hadil's death, the real message heard continually by Palestinians is die, die, die in silence. And to this insistence of silence, Ziadah responds by saying Hadil's name over and over again in order to keep her memory alive. And in the end, she says to her audience, "Give me a moment of sincere resistance where you get up off your couch," or when she says, "where you stop watching us on the evening news and you do something." In conclusion, I believe we must heed Ziadah's words at the end here, that we have to not only listen to her words, but ultimately do something.